Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and how are you doing today? I hope you are having a very nice day. Continuing with my discussion of the works of the great filmmaker John Carpenter, please allow me, if I may, to share with you some thoughts that I have about a very famous film from 1978. Halloween. When we speak about standards in modern-day horror cinema, when we talk about films that represent milestones, if you will, in the history of horror cinema and the development of the horror genre throughout the years, throughout the late 20th century and beyond, there are a number of films, I think, that generally come up in that conversation that are generally understood or seen by the general critical consensus and popular consensus to be iconic, staple, key films in the horror genre. For instance, if we're talking about films from the mid to late 20th century, so films like Psycho come to mind. Films like Night of the Living Dead comes to mind. A film like Texas Chainsaw Massacre comes to mind. And a film like Halloween comes to mind. It is that iconic and that well regarded in the horror genre, and the importance of this film in the context of horror cinema history and also cinema history in general, independent American cinema, for instance, and also the development of a certain type of cinema in the United States from the late 1970s and into the 80s, sort of the slasher genre and that sort of genre that really linked into certain modes of entertainment and filmmaking in Hollywood during that time. So in many ways, more so that I can even begin to cover in a full, rich explanation, in many ways this film is incredibly important in the context of horror cinema and also development of American independent cinema and also into Hollywood cinema of the 1980s as well. So there are a lot of strands, historical significant strands that can be traced from this film or through this film or via this film, if you know what I mean. So in many ways this film is incredibly important and quite significant in the context of John Carpenter's filmography and his history as a filmmaker, as a professional filmmaker, which is incredibly it's an incredible thing to think about, because the film itself is a very low budget affair. It has very little in terms of a sort of flashiness on the screen, if you know what I mean. There is very little that I think is going on in terms of a huge spectacle of special effects and action set pieces. On the contrary, in many respects, it's a very quiet film. It's a film that has a very low-key aspect to it, but it's a film that has certain elements that I think can be almost seen to be very homemade or quite, as I say, low-key, quiet, but there is a pulse to the film. There is a relentlessness to the film, and there is an agonizing quality of dread to the film that is, it's an amazing feat how so much can be created out of very little in terms of the very limited resources that the filmmakers had in terms of both budget and also the resources at hand. What they made was pure gold. in terms of a cinematic masterpiece, which Halloween is undoubtedly. So this is a film that is incredibly famous, so famous in fact that any comments that I would even ever hope to be able to make about this film, I think would be nothing new. There is nothing I think I can add to the conversation about this great film which hasn't been said already by much better film critics and much more astute film reviewers than I. So I don't think I'd be able to add anything new to the conversation. However, I would like just to share with you just some thoughts that I do have about this film. Once again, I was born in 1979. This film was made in 1978, so it was made before I was born. And when I was growing up, I might have mentioned this before, but my parents were fairly lenient in terms of allowing me to be able to watch horror films when I was at a young age. And one of those films that I was able to watch was the film Halloween. This was a film also that was shown on network television quite frequently. And there was a period, a rather extended period in my own childhood when I was quite young, when we were living in the United States. And so I was able to watch the film also through its so-called network television version that was shown rather frequently in the United States. And I watched that many times, as well as watching the film via VHS rental from rental stores nearby. So this is to say that this film is one that I cannot remember a time that I didn't know this film. In other words, as far back as I can remember, I seem to always have known this film. And therefore, this film in many ways is a key staple film for me. And it's one that I feel like, on the one hand, I've been very fortunate to be acquainted with in terms of being able to watch it on a number of occasions from way back in the day up to now. So in that sense, it's a film that I cannot remember never seeing. And it's been something that has always been with me. So in that sense, I don't think the film, in the brute force way that an initial watch of this film would definitely provide, I don't think it gives me those senses of shocks and scares. You know, I know where all the jump scares occur, more or less. I know where all the beats will occur when I see the film. So it doesn't give me that a jump scare effect that an initial viewing of this film, I'm sure, would have. That being said, I think this film, even after many rewatches, still unnerves, and it still leaves me shaking in many aspects as a viewer of the film, as the plot unfolds and as the characters travel through the shadowed spaces of these houses. And so I think there is so much artistry and so much craft and a lot of grace and fluidity which is so evident, and which is even more marvelous to think about, again, going back to my earlier point about how this film was made with a very limited budget and resources. The fact that something so graceful and yes, so beautiful could be made with virtually nothing is really a sight to behold. So I have nothing but an incredible amount of respect for this film, a great deal of love and admiration for this film, and so much awe, even now, for this film and what it represents. I should say also that I am a great fan. I'm a big fan of the the Halloween films that came after, and so I'm very fortunate to have, for instance, this Blu-ray set which has all the films up to the Rob Zombie films. It doesn't have the latest David Gordon Green film, of course, but the Halloween film franchise, if you will, the series, holds a lot of greatness in my eyes, and indeed in the hearts and minds of many a fan in and around the entire globe. So I'm very happy to call myself a sort of a Halloween fan, Halloween film fan. But I do recognize that in many respects, while the film Halloween, the John Carpenter film Halloween from 1978, is in many ways the first in the franchise, if you will, I also appreciate the fact that this film is one that stands on its own. In other words, I think it's a lot of fun, on the one hand, to think about the film as a start of a film series, if you will. But on the other hand, it's also quite fascinating to think of this film as its own living, breathing entity without necessarily having to rely on the subsequent films' plot development and the like. Because I think even without those, I think this film really stands the test of time, and it really works incredibly well. And I think the argument could be made, which I don't quite want to get into now because I want to focus on this film rather than the Halloween film series as a whole. But let me just say that I think there could be an argument which, as I get older, I find myself being more and more in agreement with. The argument being that I think the film Halloween might be a better film as its own standalone film. I love Halloween 2, don't get me wrong. I absolutely adore Halloween 2, and I love the developments that occur with Halloween 2 and how that is carried through Halloween 4, Halloween 5, Halloween 6, and through some extent with Halloween H2O and Resurrection. And then there's a certain turn that this franchise takes with the Rob Zombie films, and then there's even another turn that it takes with the latest film from a year or so ago. And then there's Halloween 3, which is a very interesting chapter of that series. But for me, I love that series very much, and I love the progression. More so some films than others, granted, but more or less I do love that progression. And I have, because it's been one of those staple film horror series that I've just grown up with, and I don't know any other, I didn't really think about any other way to approach the Halloween film series than this way. That being said, this film, I think, is very much I think it could be seen as a grander film, and in many ways a much more frightening film as a standalone film. And hopefully, perhaps if I am given the opportunity to talk about the other Halloween films in the context of this film, maybe not in this video, but maybe in a separate video, I would like to hopefully be able to talk about my thoughts about that, how this film is related to the other films, or how this film can be seen as its own standalone film, maybe in a separate video perhaps. But this is just therefore to say that my comments going forward in this particular video will be about this film itself, and I might make a couple of comments that relate to future films in the Halloween film series, but my focus is primarily and almost entirely on this film. And so I like to think of this film as its own living, breathing entity without necessarily having to rely on the sequels. And I think that's a related but still different topic, which I'd like to save for another occasion. So with that in mind, my friends, I'd like to focus my thoughts and comments on the 1978 work by John Carpenter, written by John Carpenter, Deborah Hill, and with music by John Carpenter, starring Jamie Lee Curtis. This is 1978's Halloween. So before I go any further, let me just tell you about this Blu-ray, which is again part of this limited, I think now out of print, 15-disc deluxe edition complete collection Halloween. At least that's what it says on the tin. And this is the Blu-ray Anchor Bay Scream Factory release. And in this set, we have the Blu-ray release of Halloween. This actually has 2 discs in it, and they both have the theatrical release version, the theatrical cut of the film. And so we have basically the same cut of the film on two separate discs. So why do we have two separate discs? Well, one is the purported 35th anniversary edition release, and so that's on disc one. And so what we have on the disc one, we have the audio commentary with John Carpenter and Jamie Lee Curtis, and then there's another audio commentary with Dean Cundy and Tommy Lee Wallace and Nick Castle. So both commentaries are really interesting and worth a listen to. But that's on those are the two commentary tracks on the first disc. And then there is a documentary called The Night She Came Home, which is about Jamie Lee Curtis, or focuses on her, which is, again, really fascinating. She is a really great actor, and her choices and her roles throughout the years have been so iconic and really very remarkable. I think she's so great. But anyway, that's that documentary. And then there is an on-location 25 years later featurette as well, plus a theatrical trailer and TV and radio spots. There's also a little supplement which is called TV version footage. Now, this is the TV version footage that was shot after the fact. This was shot around 1981, and this was shot around the time that Halloween 2 was being made. And so this was footage that was shot especially for the network television release or version of Halloween that would be shown on television. And so the idea, I think, being that not only would there be certain, maybe, if in other words, in order to maybe create a certain cut that would be of a certain running time for purposes of network television, also other considerations of network television, other edits, etc., that have to be taking place. In any event, there were certain extra scenes that were shot around 1981, and they were then inserted into certain parts of the film in order to essentially pad out the film. What's interesting also is that the scenes, there's one scene in particular, has a particular link to Halloween 2, because there's a certain plot development in Halloween 2 that occurs that isn't necessarily present in the film Halloween itself. In other words, when the film Halloween 2 was being written, after Halloween had been made, certain plot developments were concocted in order to create the storyline for Halloween 2, which I think is a really interesting and great storyline, don't get me wrong. But there is, and I'm trying to be as vague as possible here, but there are certain, there are really no indications in the original Halloween that service this plot thread. In other words, the plot twist in Halloween 2 isn't really given much foundational building blocks in Halloween. There's nothing really to suggest the plot twist in Halloween 2. But what's interesting is that the TV footage tries to give some kind of link to this plot twist in Halloween 2. It almost tries, in a sense, to sort of retrofit the original Halloween in order to have it fit more snugly with the plot developments of Halloween 2. So it does feel like footage that is doesn't. I mean, on the one hand, it does feel like additional footage because the original Halloween theatrical cut is one that is just so ingrained in my mind. But at the same time, it does provide a Halloween that can serve more as a part 1 to Halloween 2's part 2, if you know what I mean. So the TV cut is more of a film that serves as a film that precedes Halloween 2, more so than the original Halloween theatrical cut from 1978. But there are also bits of that TV footage that I think are really interesting. There are more scenes with Jamie Lee Curtis and Nancy Loomis and PJ Soles as Laurie and Annie and Linda as well. So we see more scene. We see actually one scene, and it's always nice to see those three actors together because I think their dynamic is really quite charming and really forms the sort of the emotional core, if you will, of the original Halloween, more so than anything else, I think, which is why I think one of the primary reasons why the scares in Halloween are as so effective as they are. But that's just a little something about the TV footage. Again, I'm trying to be as vague as possible because this is not a discussion about Halloween 2. Maybe when if and when I do ever have the honor of talking about Halloween 2 one day, I can further elaborate on what it is I'm referring to. But again, these are just comments about the supplements for the first disc of this Blu-ray from Anchor Bay Scream Factory. The second disc is a Blu-ray, and again, it has the same theatrical cut of Halloween, so you're essentially getting the same film on two separate discs. The difference here is that the supplements are slightly different. So on the second disc we have the theatrical trailer, TV and radio spots, but then we have a featurette called Halloween, a cut above the rest, which is like a sort of standard making of documentary. It's still very good. It's a good documentary. But also there is the commentary track, which is a spliced commentary track from three different sources, essentially. One is a commentary by John Carpenter, and the other component is commentary by Deborah Hill, and the other is a commentary by Jamie Lee Curtis. So they're all spliced together, and they're edited together to make this one seemingly seamless commentary track. So they're not all together in the same room, but they essentially recorded their own tracks separately, which were then combined to form this one commentary track. And it's actually quite famous because it's the same commentary track that actually appears on the Criterion Laserdisc release, the special edition Laserdisc release of Halloween. This is Criterion Spine number 247, and this commentary track that appears on this special edition release is also included in the second disc of this Blu-ray of Halloween. So it's really a good thing to have, because that commentary track is actually a really great one and quite informative in many respects, and hopefully I'll try to get into some aspects of that commentary track or some information which I learned from that commentary track later on in this video. So that is the Blu-ray of Halloween as we have it right here. Okay, my friends, so what I'd like to do now is I'd like to then say to you that I will be now talking about this film in detail. So if you have not seen the film Halloween, I urge you to stop this video and you can watch Halloween. Again, it's a very intense film. It's very intense film, and it's a horror film, and there is some violence in it. There's quite a great deal of violence, actually, but it's all shot, I think, very well. It's not shot in any way that's extremely bloody or sort of in-your-face, gross-out stuff, but it is very scary all the same. And so if you don't like scary films, then I would suggest actually not watching this film, because it is very scary, and I don't want to recommend a scary film to anyone who is not into scary films. But if you are okay with watching a scary film and you haven't seen Halloween, then please stop this video and try to find a copy of Halloween and watch it. And when you've finished watching it, please come back at any time, and then at which time it will be my pleasure to be able to talk to you, my dear friends, about this very famous film, John Carpenter's Halloween.